In the spring of 2009, a few months after Barack Obama was inaugurated president, I received an email from somebody on the White House staff inviting me to come to the White House and have dinner with the president. And I thought, boy, this is pretty cool. The invitation went on to say that I was part of a small group of historians who were being brought to the White House by the new president to see what history could tell him, President Obama, about the job that he was undertaking. More precisely, about how his predecessors in the job had approached their work, what they had tried, what they had accomplished, why they had succeeded where they had succeeded, why they had failed where they had failed. I inferred that the reason that I was on the list was that I had just published a book about Franklin Roosevelt, the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. And the book came out just ahead of the 2008 election, which occurred just several months after a financial crisis on Wall Street and financial markets around the world that had pushed the American economy and the economies of several other countries to the brink of what looked like it might be another Great Depression. And so, all of a sudden, it appeared that the example of Franklin Roosevelt in dealing with the crisis of the Great Depression of the 1930s might be apt for a president who was dealing with the economic crisis of 2009. In fact, not long after Barack Obama was elected president, there was a cover of Time magazine, one of the major news magazines in America. On the cover of Time magazine, there was a photo of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was this characteristic-looking guy. People of my parents' generation and their parents' generation, they knew Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, the longest-serving president in American history. He was president for 12 years. He was elected 4 times. That feat will never be repeated because the Constitution has been changed so that you can't get elected more than twice anymore. But Franklin Roosevelt was president for 12 years during one of the great crises of American history. In fact, the double crisis of the Great Depression and then World War II. So everybody knew the face of Franklin Roosevelt. Everybody knew his characteristic pose. Franklin Roosevelt had been afflicted with polio when he was in his 30s, and ever after, he was confined largely to a wheelchair. He could stand with effort, but he couldn't move. He couldn't walk at all. He had very heavy braces on his legs and all. And so he typically toured, he typically made appearances in the back of a convertible car, an open-topped car, one of the big sedans of the 1930s. And typically he would be sitting in the back of the car, and he always had a big smile on his face, and he was smoking. In those days, I won't say everybody smoked, but a lot of people smoked, and they didn't think about what the health consequences might be. And Roosevelt smoked using a cigarette holder. And so the holder was about this long, you put the cigarette in the end. And he always had the holder either in his teeth or in his hand, but it kind of jutted up at this jaunty angle. And it was interpreted as jaunty, in partly because Roosevelt always had this very optimistic air, even at the darkest times of the Depression. And he wore a typical hat. And so everybody sort of knew this was a picture of Franklin Roosevelt, except in this cover of Time magazine, the face of Franklin Roosevelt had been photoshopped out, and photoshopped in was the face of Barack Obama. And the caption above the picture said, Franklin Delano Obama, ? Question mark. So, the question is Barack Obama, the new president, going to have to deal with what Franklin Roosevelt had to deal with during the Great Depression? So it apparently occurred to either President Obama or somebody on his staff that a guy, me, who had written this book, this new book on Franklin Roosevelt, might have something worthwhile to say. The other participants in the dinner were other historians who had written on Lyndon Johnson, who had written on John Kennedy, who had written on Presidents Abraham Lincoln, on George Washington. And so it was a group of their presidential historians. So it wasn't just sort of any old historians, but historians who had written about presidents. And the idea, once again, it became apparent. And there was a brief reception where we introduced to the president, and then we all went into dinner, and there were a dozen of us or so sitting around this table. And it was clear from the invitation, and it became clear from the introductions and from remarks that President Obama and his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, made at the beginning of the dinner. What was afoot? What was in mind? And between Rahm Emanuel and Barack Obama, President Obama, the two of them explained their sort of interpretation of the presidency. And it's a pretty standard interpretation of the presidency. And that is that in American history, there are a handful, a very small handful, of presidents who are perceived to be the greatest presidents. And the great triumvirate consists of George Washington, the first president, Abraham Lincoln, the president who saved the Union and freed the slaves, and Franklin Roosevelt, who guided the country through the dual crisis of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II. And so it is understandably tempting, and I wasn't surprised, that President Obama and members of his staff at the dinner, including Rahm Emanuel, said, you know, we'd like this presidency, this president, to be seen in the same light as these great transformative presidents. Now, they had enough historical insight to realize that nobody's going to be another George Washington. There's only one father of his country, as Washington long has been called. But furthermore, Washington is so important in the history of the presidency, primarily because he was the first, and there's only one first. So you can't do him. So presidents don't really measure themselves against George Washington. They're tempted to measure themselves against Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. And they spoke, President Obama, Rahm Emanuel, spoke in terms that political scientists have often adopted regarding presidencies, and their presidencies, like Lincoln's and Roosevelt's, that they call transformative presidencies. A lot of presidencies are simply a matter of moving things forward. They're status quo presidencies. They don't require great change. They don't require the president to rise to a great challenge. Just push things forward, manage the system reasonably well, and you'll be okay. But those presidents aren't considered the greatest ones. The greatest ones, these transformative presidents. So being someone who has studied presidents for a long time, I wasn't surprised at this, and I know that presidents, when they come into office, they want to be considered one of the greats. People who become president get their part because they're ambitious, and these are laudable ambitions, be a great president. But I had some reservations as I was listening to this. And the reservations were partly historical, and partly they were a matter of, I guess, protocol. So the thing that went through my mind is, when you are a guest at someone's house, they're serving you dinner, they've invited you over, simple politeness, I think, requires you to think about what you're going to say and what you're going to do. I mean, especially if this is the White House and this is the President of the United States who's your host. And so the question that I had is, what do you do? What do you do when your host is saying something you think is quite wrong-headed? And especially if your host happens to be, and the person saying this happens to be the President of the United States. What do you do? And I thought about it. I thought to myself, while President Obama was speaking, I thought, well, okay, presidents are busy people. And this president has seen fit to take a couple hours out of his busy schedule to sit down and talk to some historians. And I assumed, and this seems like a reasonable assumption, that he didn't do it just to hear himself talk. I assumed that he probably wanted to hear what we had to say. Now, I'm going to say that this is not universally true. Some presidents just like to hear themselves talk. Theodore Roosevelt would invite historians and artists and authors and scientists and other really accomplished people to the White House for dinner, and he would proceed to speak the whole time. But Barack Obama didn't strike me that way. Certainly not from the way he spoke during the reception and all the other signals we were getting. So I assumed that he really brought us there, we historians, he brought us there to hear what we had to say. So I said, okay, he brought me here to hear what I had to say, I'm going to tell him what I think. And so at the first reasonable opportunity, I said, Mr. President, I appreciate your comments, but I have to differ with you. And the difference is basically this, that I think you're taking the wrong models for your presidency. And I said that there is this paradox about American history, especially American presidential history. And the paradox is that the greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, presided over the worst times. Think about it for a moment. You know, the Civil War, 700,000 people died in this fighting of American against American. You know, there wasn't a worse time, the 3.5, 4 years of the Civil War. You know, these were terrible times. And Franklin Roosevelt. You know, Franklin Roosevelt was president during the Great Depression. This was the worst economic disaster in American history. And World War II was the worst war in world history. 50, 60 million people died in World War II. So, you know, unless you're thinking that there's going to be a civil war, or there really is going to be another Great Depression, then maybe you ought to lower your sights a little bit in choosing your model for the president. Because it was precisely the Civil War that allowed Abraham Lincoln to become the great presidential leader he became. The Civil War gave him the opportunity to rise to an unprecedented challenge in American history, to definitively determine the answer to the question that had plagued American politics from the writing of the Constitution. When push comes to shove, who takes precedence, the states or the national government? And it had been argued, reasonably argued, by many people, and not just Southerners, that the states came before the national government, that the states could secede if push came to shove. And the matter had not been settled, but it was settled by Abraham Lincoln. It was settled not in a court of law, it was settled on the battlefield, but it was certainly settled. And the other major problem that had vexed American life since the 18th century, slavery. Slavery within a republic. How can you have slavery, a grossly unequal institution, in a republic which is based on the principle that all men are created equal? Those two just don't fit. The political system hadn't been able to manage it, but Lincoln was able to do it because of the Civil War. So, President Obama, you know, unless you're thinking there's going to be another Civil War, don't take Abraham Lincoln as a model, because you're not going to get there. And likewise, Franklin Roosevelt's not a good model, because unless you think that this recession that we're in, starting in 2008, just before he became president, unless you think this is going to become a full-blown depression, then Franklin Roosevelt's model is not going to work. What allowed Roosevelt to become this model of a crisis president was precisely the crisis. And it was the fact that the economy had tanked that allowed him to pass the measures of the New Deal, that allowed him to set the federal government on the course that it followed for the next 50 years, and arguably even beyond. And likewise, you know, unless you think there's going to be a world war, you're not going to be a world leader like Franklin Roosevelt was. So A better model, perhaps, would be not Franklin Roosevelt, but Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, there's somebody that you can emulate in their rankings of presidents. Political scientists, historians, typically identify Washington, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt as the top three, but right below there, 4 or 5, is Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, he was a progressive, and Barack Obama considered himself to be a progressive. What does progressive mean? Someone who thought that the government needed to step in and address problems that the private marketplace was leaving unaddressed or unresolved. In Theodore Roosevelt's day, it had to do with consumer protection. It had to do with excessive power of the trusts, the monopolies. It had to do with conservation. It had to do with child labor and protection of rights of women and so on. In Barack Obama's presidency, it was clear, this is 2009, that a top priority would be to reform America's healthcare system so that people that didn't have medical insurance could get insurance. It was a failure of the market, and there were some 40 million people who didn't have health insurance. And they were just one accident or one bad illness away from bankruptcy. So, Theodore Roosevelt had this, oh, and by the way, Theodore Roosevelt had in fact thought that the government ought to take responsibility for health insurance as well, but he didn't quite get around to it in his era. But anyway, I said, so Theodore Roosevelt he's considered one of those near great presidents, or maybe great but not the greatest presidents. And furthermore, he was a progressive in line with what the Obama agenda seems to propose. And the best thing of all is, for the American people, in contrast to the 1860s, which were a terrible time in American history, in contrast to the 1930s, which were a terrible time in American history, Theodore Roosevelt presided over 7.5 years of peace and prosperity. So not only was the Theodore Roosevelt presidency good for Roosevelt's historical reputation, it was good for the American people, and they liked it and they liked him. Oh yeah, and one thing too, any president who gets elected once, and President Obama had just been elected the first time, they're already thinking about getting reelected. When Theodore Roosevelt ran for election in 1904, technically it wasn't re-election because he became president by virtue of the death of his predecessor. He was vice president to William McKinley. But it was in effect a referendum on his performance in 1904, and he won an enormous victory. In fact, it was the largest popular vote margin in American history until then. So model yourself after Theodore Roosevelt. Don't think that you can resolve something, an issue as big as slavery just by a stroke of your Emancipation Proclamation pen. That's not going to have, at least we hope that we're not going to get in a crisis where that's possible. And hope that this doesn't become a full-blown Great Depression. But hope that you can keep this from becoming that, and that you can push the boundaries of that progressive envelope out a little bit. And do this, you'll get reelected, and history will consider you right up there. Maybe not with Washington and Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, but maybe up there beside Theodore Roosevelt. So, this is what I said. And President Obama listened, and I will certainly give him credit. He listened. He listened to me, he listened to the people. In fact, after giving his opening remarks, which lasted all of 5 minutes, he basically just sat there and listened. He definitely wasn't a Theodore Roosevelt in dominating the conversation. Theodore Roosevelt was one who really had to be at the center of every event. In fact, his daughter, who understood her father, she said, if you want to understand my father, the thing you need to remember is he has to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Well, Barack Obama was not that way. He was listening. And so he listened, and he sort of nodded, and Rahm Emanuel, his Secretary of State, they nodded, okay, thank you, you've given us something to think about. So the conversation continued. And after dinner, President Obama said, dinner started at 7. He looked at his watch, it was 9 o'clock. He said, got to go and kiss the girls goodnight. His 2 daughters, they were upstairs, and he was going to kiss them goodnight. And that was our signal, okay, dinner's over. So I walked out and went to my hotel. And the next day I flew back to Austin. And the day after that, I got an email from the White House staffer who had organized the dinner saying, Professor Brands, thank you for coming to Washington, and thank you for giving us your thoughts on history and the presidency and the possibilities for this presidency. And then at the end of the email it said, but we still think that this can be a transformative presidency. So that was the immediate reaction. However, and I don't claim credit for this, but about, I guess it was a year and a half later, President Obama adopted much of the language of Theodore Roosevelt in promoting his own progressive agenda. And in fact, he went to a place in Kansas where Theodore Roosevelt had given a landmark speech during the progressive era and articulating what the responsibility of government was and what it should be, advocating a larger role for government to deal with things that had fallen through the cracks of the private sector, stating a stronger position for democracy, that is, democracy under America's government, where capitalism, the operations of the private sector economy, had failed. And President Obama basically channeled Theodore Roosevelt, spoke in words very similar to Theodore Roosevelt's, cited Theodore Roosevelt, and gave the speech at the same place that Theodore Roosevelt had given this widely noted speech that all the history books about Theodore Roosevelt describe in characterizing Roosevelt as this great progressive leader. So, again, I'm certainly not going to say that it was my suggestion that caused President Obama to give this speech. He had lots of advisors and many people who are more attuned to politics than I was or am. But it's interesting. But it also raises a question. And it raises a question that really was the heart of what the point of this dinner was. And that is, what can the past tell us that is of use regarding the present? And I'm going to sharpen the question a little bit because the question comes up all the time. It's one of the reasons that students like you are required to take American history. That the people who make the regulations, in this case, the legislature of the state of Texas and the Board of Higher Education, they think that knowing American history will make you a better citizen. I happen to agree with them. I think that's quite true. But having said that, I will say also that you don't want to try to push this too far. So at this particular dinner, the question was, is Abraham Lincoln a good role model for a president in the 21st century? Is Franklin Roosevelt? And I suggested Theodore Roosevelt would be a better model. But even then, the question is, are any past presidents good models for presidents today? And it doesn't apply simply to presidents. So if you happen to be the CEO of a corporation, is what Henry Ford did in his corporation, is it a model for you today? And the answer is, this is part of the unsatisfying category of historical answers. The answer is yeah, partly yes and partly no. But I would say, I'll sharpen it even a little further still. So I wrote a book about Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt is one of those individuals that a lot of people can like. He was a Republican in his day, remember the Republican Party, but that was at a time when a Republican could be very progressive, and we would call it liberal. So he was a Republican who advocated a larger role for government in American life. Now that's not something that Republicans advocate today, but in Roosevelt's day, a Republican could do it. So if you are a Democrat and you believe in a larger role for government today, then there's a lot of stuff in Theodore Roosevelt's history and his biography you can like. And of course, if you're a Republican, you can remember that Theodore Roosevelt was a very popular Republican president, so you can like him on those grounds. And also, Theodore Roosevelt resides far enough in the past that the issues that were important in his day are no longer so sensitive. So I later wrote a book about Ronald Reagan. And the issues that Ronald Reagan was dealing with are still very live issues. And so people would directly channel from Reagan to the present, and if they thought I went too easy on Reagan, then they wouldn't like me because it didn't suit their politics today, and if I thought I was too hard on Reagan, vice versa. When you talk about deeper history, farther back in the past, these issues don't come up so much. But so anyway, so Theodore Roosevelt is a lot of people's favorite president. He's lost a little bit of the luster lately since the start of the Black Lives Matter movement, because he was somebody who thought in racial terms that aren't suitable today. He was, I mean, I wouldn't use the term racist to describe him. Some people do, but his thinking on race doesn't sit very well with modern audiences. Again, he was far from the worst in this regard. There were plenty of people who were way more racist than Theodore Roosevelt. But leaving that aside, there's just, people can like Roosevelt because he was a Rough Rider, he was a soldier. And they can like him because he was a cowboy. They can like him because he was this awkward kid who grew up to be an athlete and who had this buoyant spirit. He was the youngest president in American history. He had this household full of small kids who were running around the White House, and he was always saying these kind of outrageous things. So there's a lot of drama in his life. Anyway, so one of the questions that I've gotten after having written the book came out in the 1990s, so it's been a long time, but I get questions on the order of, so what would Theodore Roosevelt do today? And the implication is, boy, they don't make him like Theodore Roosevelt anymore. I wish they would, and he'd come in and he'd fix this, whatever it is. There is a strong tendency on the part of any present generation to think that people did it better in the past, and the politicians today are notoriously corrupt or inept or something. And if we could just get somebody like Theodore Roosevelt today, then he would solve our problems. And I have to say that probably not, and this for a couple of reasons. One is that when we look to the past and say, what would so-and-so do? What would Abraham Lincoln do? What would George Washington do? The only ones we think about bringing back to life and bringing to the present are the all-stars from the past. And so nobody says, what would Millard Fillmore do? And what if we brought Franklin Pierce here, or Andrew Johnson, or something like that? No. So the people who were failures in their day, nobody even thinks about that. So the only ones we talk about as bringing back to life are the ones who were successes. But here's the key. Here's why even that is not a good model. The reason they were successes was that they suited their times. For a president to be successful, for anybody to be successful in any field, you have to suit your moment. Moments change, times changed. I can say this, that Theodore Roosevelt believed that government in 1901, when he became president, was too small, and that it needed to beef up to deal with the problems the country was confronting. He believed that the Democratic side of America's mix of democracy and capitalism, the democracy side had to beef up to be able to play at an equal level with the capitalist side. And so he was in favor of bigger government than existed in 1901. If Theodore Roosevelt came back to Earth today, would he be in favor of bigger government today? And I have to say, I have no idea. And here's why. Because the government that Theodore Roosevelt inherited in 1901 was probably 1/20th the size of government today. So Theodore Roosevelt might have thought that government should be 2 times as big, 3 times as big, 4 times as big as it was when he inherited it in 1901. And he might have thought that, okay, let's make it 5 times as big as it is. I mean, 5 times, he wouldn't have said that. Let's say twice as big as it is today, as it was then. Okay, but twice as big as it was in 1901 would leave it still 1/10 the size that it is today. And so Theodore Roosevelt might be a hardcore conservative today. He might be a reactionary today. He might say government has gotten way too big. I simply don't know. Times have changed. Another thing is that Theodore Roosevelt quite possibly couldn't get elected president today. Presidents have to get elected. Now, admittedly, he became president the first time by inheriting the job when William McKinley died, but he got elected in his own right. He had a style that suited his day. You know, when I said that Theodore Roosevelt had views on race and cultures and immigration that don't suit modern, progressive, liberal sensibilities, that's quite true. But if he had modern views, he never would have become president in the first place. To get in the door of the White House, you have to speak in the language of the times. You have to share sometimes the prejudices of the times. So what would Theodore Roosevelt do today? I don't really know.